their village, wherever they're living. And then they make their way, well, they stop at the temple and visit there. They move in boats. They stop at a little viewing pavilion under the Great Cliff, etc. Let's go on then a little bit. Yes, here's the next section now. Now we have another transition section that's simply made up of massive rocky forms and little indications of how you get from one place to another, bits of the path and so on. A quite wonderful slope or almost flat area in the left foreground, indicated only by washes. And then rocky masses, progressively lighter as you go back, shaped wonderfully with different faces of the trees, and then a ravine with fog, and then needle peaks in the upper left. This is the sort we have in Li Tong paintings. Well, the whole thing embodies, I think, an extreme clarity of thought and vision. And again, I echo Max Lohr in saying that. Okay. The trees, as you see here on the left, are fused into groups, but differentiated within the group by varying kinds of brushwork. There's some sense of movement in the execution, but stillness in the whole scene generally. The whole thing is polished, terse. Those are Max Lohr's words, I think. The culmination of a whole movement. Well, it's hard to think where it will go from here. What's going to happen next? Well, we'll talk about that. It's as though he has rid the landscape of all heaviness, dissolved substance, penetrated with mist. One has glimpses through the mist of things to see. Sometimes close up and obvious, sometimes mistily here. I mean, it's in the distance. Okay, the next section, I may not have absolutely all the sections here, but pretty much all. Then we have a scene with a covered bridge, and then to the left of it here, thatched houses and figures. So we're back to a little bit of human habitation. And on the bridge, there were two figures, as I remember. I'll have a detail of it in a minute. Anyway, some dramatically crossed pine trees on the right side, and leafy groups of leafy trees beyond that, and these powerful landscape forms, and then beyond, nothing except washes of ink, as though we were gazing out. Well, I should say here that as you go on in the scroll, the washes of ink in the upper part become a bit heavier, not strikingly, but heavier, as though the day is growing later. And I believe that's indeed what is happening. And you end with a scene of return, as we'll see. So it does follow my ideal narrative. This scene, showing the slope at the right and the leafy trees and these dramatic pine trees, and then the bridge with two figures. I think it's one person gazing at the scenery and his servant behind him. Bridge built up on posts, covered bridge, and then on the to the left here, thatched houses with figures. Okay, the next, please. Let's see. Yes. Okay. Here's the detail of the right side with the dramatic pine trees, spiky, long. I mean, they end with sharp strokes, giving this sort of dramatic effect of pushing outward, and bits of leafage or pine needles seen. They're very, very clear what they are. And here you can see the drawing of the bridge. And then here on the other side, here's the bit with the thatched houses on the shore, and people in a boat unloading some kind of goods they brought by boat. Somebody handing something heavy to somebody on the shore, and something, in other words, sort of semi-commercial going on. And then beyond that, the houses, where we are to understand whatever it is going to be used. Maybe it's an inn. I don't think there's a flag, but at any rate, okay. Now, here, let me show this. This is I should say that this scroll, as I say, exists in many copies, but two of the old copies of sections of it are in Japan, in Japanese collections. And they're very long in Japan, and they're very famous. And one scholar, I'll speak of later, Suzuki Kei, actually argued that these are closer to the original, and that the painting in Taiwan was the later copy, a Ming copy or something. I think he's quite wrong. And I spoke up after his paper, which was given in a symposium, the first great international symposium in Taiwan in 1970. I spoke up after his paper, pointing out something that originally had been pointed out by Robert Treat Paine, a curator of Japanese art for many years at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Paine, who was writing an article about some Japanese painter who copied this composition, had made a point about the difference between the Japanese version and the Chinese. Over here on the left, in the Japanese version, as I take it to be, there are two buildings, both with flags out, as though they are both inns, both about the same size. And as Paine said, this indicates a kind of competition, a theme that wouldn't have been allowed in a Chinese painting, which was much too sort of idealized to inject the idea of two places competing with each other for customers. It's a funny, but I think true point. I think Paine is absolutely right. But in general, these are much sharper brushwork and heavier forms, and everything about them is, I think, wrong for Shaogui. So I'm on the opposite side from Suzuki Kei, and I said so at the time. I'll speak about that paper again. Here's a detail of the Japanese copy, which is in one of the great museums in Japan. I forget which, doesn't matter. And you see people in the houses. It's all a lot more going on in the painting, and you see the rather more prominent brushwork, heavier brush line. Well, this is the hand of a Japanese copyist, I believe. Okay, now going on with the real scroll. So slide of the next section. This is a detail from it, and we have another passage of human habitation, a little cluster of thatched houses of the kind where you might stop and rest, and you indeed see somebody sitting at a table inside the building, and a servant coming and serving him something, a bowl of soup or whatever, and outside a servant with a mule and a load of things. Anyway, quite beautiful painting of the trees, again, the nearer and further separated by ink tonality, quite wonderfully handled. Okay, enough of that. Next, please. Then comes a passage which is one of the great ones. Here the mountain peaks loom above an area of mist, and the mist actually, the misty gorge that somehow goes below the lower limit of the hand scroll, as though way down below. Well, how can you represent space below the limit of the hand scroll? You can't, except he does. How he does it, you arrive at a little tingsel here, a viewing pavilion, located here in the more or less middle right, on the rocky ledge overlooking this misty depth, whatever, and then with wonderful subtle use of ink washes, he suggests the mist and trees to the left here growing from down below, indicating more depths below. So he gives the effect of a bottomless, or very deep gorge of some kind, filled with fog, powerful. And then rising above this, these extraordinarily powerful mountain forms. Well, as I say, the whole thing is like it's the culmination of a whole movement we've been seeing from through Li Tong and eventually Ma Yuan and so on, and perhaps culminating or here. But it's hard to think of where it might go from here. He has somehow rid the landscape of all the kind of heaviness that it has in some others, Li Tong and so on. Mist penetrates the scenes here and the valleys and gorges and so forth. By comparison, Ma Yuan's paintings seem, well, not only dramatized, but somewhat artificial. Too much of the artist's hand and temperament, so to speak. Nothing in this, there's nothing of that kind of hand of the artist in the real Shaogui as I see it. Mao Yuan's is an imitable style, and indeed you have just endless imitations of Mao Yuan. But Shaogui scarcely is, and there's scarcely any followers of Shaogui. In China, certainly. His style does underlay a certain amount of great painting in the Muromachi period in Japan. That's another matter. I'll speak of very briefly at the end. But it's hardly followed up in China. Something as great as this, which is condemned by this awful critic at the end of the 13th century and others as something just too low class to be worth looking at. Well, okay. Landscape painting, just to speak about that a bit more, landscape painting has been developing in certain directions toward a more subtle use of ink monochrome for atmosphere and space, toward a softening of forms, toward eroding them with mist, so to speak, more and more spacious paintings, less of solid mass, and by the time of Shaogui we have what seems to be a total mastery of this. Now, where can landscape go from here? We'll see where in Shan or Zen painting in our last lecture, further dissolution into paintings that might seem to be even more a dead end. Well, that's a kind of false art historical construction involving deterministic notions about art that we have to avoid. So I take it back in a way. There are no dead ends really in painting, or else there. But okay, next please. Here is the detail of the little tingza on the edge of the gorge, or the great foggy bottom, whatever, space, where one imagines sitting looking down into it. All right, then the next one, next please. Here is the section that I reproduced part of, at least, in my Skira book long ago. And we're getting later. The sky is a bit darker, and darker washes are appearing up in the upper part of the picture. And we have another huge rocky mass which sort of pushes us leftward, impelling us as if on our way toward the end of the painting. And a group of leafy trees. And then down here, a bridge built of poles, only one rail on one side, very simply built. Here's the detail of it. Here's the detail. With a returning farmer, or whoever it is, making his way over this bridge, a familiar figure by now, and making his way toward the end of the scroll where it will end. In the distance, vegetation seen through the fog, wonderfully drawing of the swirling water coming out of the middle ground and flowing into the foreground. Just the sheer achievement of drawing the water so that it establishes the ground plane as fully as this, as easily as this, and so as convincingly as this. Well, as I said, all this is rejected, along with Southern Swing Academy painting generally, and belittled by the dominant literati critics of the beginning of the Yuan dynasty, who began publishing at that time and writing stuff that's still preserved. As an example, you can see in the Bush and Schur book, pages 138 to 40, excerpts from the writing of the critic Zhuang Su, writing around 1298, very end of the 13th century, who calls Shaogui's paintings exceedingly vulgar and bad, and suggests that they were popular only because they belonged to an age of great corruption and so on, not really worth our attention. On the other hand, Shaogui's greatness was recognized by some later critics, and one should say that for the later critics. Dong Qichang, the late Ming great painter critic, wrote favorably about Shaogui in contrast to the others.